Hey, Ivan.
Malcolm, how's it going?
Good. So we're here to talk about um, coercion, and the question that we found as something of a crux between us is something like whether or not coercion is efficient or correlated with efficiency. Um, and there's kind of a bunch of ideas that we're sort of pulling together. And Yeah, I figure this like I'm giving this little preface because we do intend to post this to YouTube probably, but um, I don't intend in general to conduct this anything like a podcast per se. But given that I don't intend to record a different preface before putting it to YouTube, hello YouTube, this is the preface for you guys. All right, let's dive in. Let's forget about YouTube and have our conversation.
Great.
Um, uh, so. Yeah, so I read the pieces that you sent me. I think one of them is called like Searching for the Roots of the Tree of Evil, and the other is this unpublished piece contrasting enforcement and attunement as two ways of doing coordination. Um and uh and you've read the stuff I sent you at least once because you had prior to that. And which was the yeah, my coercion and PCT post, which I saw that you cited in your in the attunement one, which makes sense. And so I'm very much feeling this sort of sense of like, yes, like intellectual development and kind of, the um and then yeah, it was occurring to me also that like that last chapter, like as I kind of read that and was thinking about that, it was occurring to me that that last chapter of behavior, the control of perception, is also one of the main sources that I'm implicitly kind of referring to also in that PCT, like in my coercion post, because it's like the same basic theory.
Yeah, so I just reread that this morning. This is the last chapter 18 of Behavior, the Control of Perception, where the author kind of goes on a rant about or a speculation, I guess,
Yeah.
about how I guess he claims that like interpersonal control is impossible. It's not it's like worse than a mistake. It's worse than it's not evil, it's not bad, it's not a sin, it's like literally impossible. You cannot control another human being.
Mhm.
And I guess if I had to say it in my own words, why is it impossible? It's impossible because we don't have access to the internals of the other person's control system. And so we can never tell if we're like trying to force the other person to behave in a certain way. We can never tell if they're like going to cooperate or going to like undermine us in some way or turn violent at some point,
Hmm.
which felt uh which feels like very optimistic to me, and like weirdly mystical. It's like, okay, yes, I don't know exactly what is going on in Malcolm's brain right now, but like I have a pretty good guess. Humans are just like not that different from each other. And especially if I have some level of control over your environment, I can actually like, if I like turned off the lights in your room right now, or turned on or like started screaming really loudly into the microphone, I would have like a pretty good sense of what your mind state is like and what how you would behave in response.
Mm-hmm. But I think even to just take that example, so suppose that you start screaming into the microphone. Like there's a few things that I could do.
Mhm.
Um, a few different types of strategies I could take. One is to be like, what, are you okay? Like, depending, if your screaming seemed like distress. If your screaming seemed like you were just trying to bother me, I actually have like five different ways that I could stop that. I could turn off my speakers, like my external speakers that are plugged in. I could hit mute on my computer. I could unplug my computer from the Ethernet, which would cause the internet to disconnect and your signal to be unable to come through. I could like maybe I don't know if closing my laptop would work. I wouldn't try that one, but um,
Right.
probably not because I have the external monitor, so it wouldn't cause it to sleep. Um, I could turn down the volume. Like so you've given me a stimulus as the perceptual control theory people would put it, that I have to now deal with, but you don't get to control how I deal with it. You can
Right.
predict that in some way I will try to make that problem go away, but I actually have many options. I could also step away from the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right?
This is maybe not a good example. Maybe a better example is yeah, I guess like the two, maybe it's useful to lay out like some examples of control, of like interpersonal control.
Mhm.
The two that come to mind, the two that seem especially puzzling to me from the perspective of coercion is employment and militaries. Maybe let's start with employment because that's a kind of a simple, or that's a more kind of standard one. Militaries are kind of an extreme example of like coercion and control.
Mhm.
But in the kind of traditional employment relationship, uh, you're especially, let's take the example of a salaried employee, right? Where typically where you pay or I guess hourly or salaried or whatever. Yeah, but it's like the important thing is like the incentives that I provide. If I were your boss, the incentives that I provide to you are like I pay you per hour or per month or
Mhm.
something like that, and I have a threat of firing you.
Mhm.
I also maybe have some incentives about like promote. I maybe also provide some incentives like promotion, but especially in like lower paid jobs, the threat of firing is kind of the operating incentive at most times. And in fact, if I were your boss, you would like, and we were on a Zoom call, you would not be able to disconnect
Um,
because there's an implicit threat at all times that like, if you don't do what I say, or if you disobey me directly, then you'll be fired, at least within the confines of the employment relation. And
yeah.
it just seems like something like most people most of the time are operating in that kind of situation where there's like there's a threat that like if you don't do the thing that the people around you tell you to do, you will be fired or some other terrible consequence will happen. And so that feels like it contradicts this chapter 18, the behavior control of perception
Hmm.
thesis that interpersonal control is impossible.
Hmm. Well,
When you
that
do
makes
think it's
sense. I
impossible,
mean,
it's everywhere.
yeah, I mean that makes sense because I mean, like William Powers, who wrote that, had never heard of employment.
Wait, same way.
Yeah, I'm completely making that up. Like, but the thing I'm trying to highlight is like, he may not have addressed that
Right.
counterexample, but surely he was aware of it. Like he was, so whatever he was saying was not like,
Great. Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a sense of how he would? Do you have a sense of how he'd respond to that, or yeah? How do you classify that?
yeah. So I mean, it's interesting. Like, and I probably should have reread chapter 18 myself to kind of refresh myself with some of the ideas and examples that he uses in there. Um, but but yeah, like the I can tell you how I think about
Please,
control in the
I don't
context of
actually care about William
employment.
Powers.
Probably
I want.
more rich and alive. Um, so there's a few pieces here. Like something like approximate control is possible. Like rough kind of herding of cats, um and that's broadly what we see in the context of employment
Hmm.
um and sorry, that's broadly what we see in the context yeah, so that's probably what we see in the context of employment, with the caveat that like maybe some employment is yet a different thing, which has more of the attuned quality to it. And to just kind of very briefly point at the distinction, you know, there is there are many people right now who are currently doing a thing for money that they would rather not do.
Yeah.
Um, that is not necessarily uh there's a question of the extent to which whether like the extent to which that's coercion. It gets subtle, but I want to contrast it with there are other people who are doing a thing for money which they are happy to do, But part of the reason they're getting paid money is that they need money to live. And so if they weren't getting paid money to do this, they'd have to get money some other way, which would then stop them from being able to do this thing that they want to do.
Yeah.
And you can see how those are two very different scenarios. And it, or maybe you can, I don't know. Like, to me, those feel very different in a number of ways.
Um, yeah, I have there's some questions I have about like wants and like what does it mean to want to do something independent of the money, or like, yeah, there's like, can you really unbundle things that way? But I know I know what you mean. Let's
Yeah, yeah. And we, we may need to get into the nitty-gritty of that, because it's like, in this situation, it's like, is that person still free of the threat of, because they really want to do the thing, actually, in a way, like the threat of being fired has even a different kind of weight to it, where someone being fired from a job that they hate, maybe they're like, I'll go find another one. Like, whereas this guy's like, oh no, now I can't do this thing that I love doing because I need to make money some other way, right? So it's in terms of like the possibility for coercion, and there's a difference there, but like there is a very key difference in terms of where the basic motivation for doing the thing comes from.
Right.
Like, this person's not doing it at all without the incentive. This person is like happy to do it. And so in a sense, as long as that person and their boss, or the person paying them, do already agree enough on the value of what they're doing, the boss can kind of get out of the way. Like,
Right.
does not have to maintain a kind of rigidity,
Yeah.
because insofar as that person just already bought in on solving the exact problem they've been hired to solve, they just want to solve it, and they're just doing that. Um, and and at that point, the boss attempting to micromanage is actually very obviously going to like make things worse, because it's sort of going to get in the person's way. Which is not to say the boss might know some other extra things that are like relevant and need incorporating or whatever. Um, so let's see. Okay, so
If I can interrupt,
yeah,
I maybe it's worth diving, at least touching on the like our core crux, which is something about efficiency of coercion.
yeah.
And then I think that'll help clarify what specific examples we need to like look at in detail. Um, and yeah, I guess if I had to articulate this claim, so yeah, what maybe kind of on a personal level, why is this interesting to me? It's helpful to center it that way. One is that, yeah, as you know, I'm kind of like trying to build better coordination tools
Mhm.
for some people,
Yeah.
and I have this, and one of the interesting pushbacks I've gotten on this is like, aren't we already too coordinated? And I'm like, yeah, actually, in some ways we are. It feels like many areas of our lives were like too dependent on other people and feel
Mm-hmm.
too restricted by what institutions or governments or even like uh, our neighbors want us to do. And so, like, do we really actually want there to be more coordination? And so I think that that's where the kind of attunement versus enforcement. I want to kind of like
Right.
slice the part of coordination that is kind of that feels more like dancing with someone. So it's like
Hmm.
perfectly voluntary and involves like deep attunement and it creates something beautiful.
Hmm.
And the part of coordination that feels more like feels bad in the sense that it like removes freedom or dignity or like renders one less than human in the way that a lot of like hierarchical or coercive or enforcement type coordination does. And
Hmm.
like, I'm not worried about enforcement. I think our tools for enforcement are getting better and better. The ability of our institutions and governments to like monitor us in detail and provide fine-tuned rewards and punishments to like make sure we behave in the right way. Like, that technology is progressing rapidly. It's not going anywhere. That trend isn't going anywhere. I would
Yeah. Yeah.
ideally build, I would like to kind of like differentially advance the cause of like attunement based coordination. Um,
Yeah. Nice.
So that's one motivation. And the second motivation, maybe, which will also connect to this, is just on a personal level. I'm kind of like, I'm curious about the various uh, therapy inspired, like post-rationalist kind of ideologies that say self-coercion is bad, that like
Mm-hmm.
you should not act out of self-coercion, and also that most behavior, for example, like our society trains us to be self-coercive, for example, in school or in most kind of like entry-level jobs, and that
Yeah.
this is bad and dehumanizing. And I'm like in the process of transitioning. I feel myself to be in the process of transitioning from a more self-coercive way of being to a less self-coercive way of being. At the same time, I'm like conflicted about this because I'm not sure that I'm not sure one can actually get to a non-coercive equilibrium, or whether that would even be desirable. So that's kind of laying out my motivations for engaging.
Yeah, yeah. And for me, like, yeah, and so then yeah, I do feel I feel the pull between us where it's sort of like I'm like, yeah, I mean I've also been in that process for, a long time in a way. And one of the things I've come to discover is that it was not as easy, and has not been, and is still not in some ways as easy, although um but certainly has sort of taken longer than I might have imagined. But does feel increasingly like possible for me, and there's a sense of like it being yeah, I don't feel doubt about whether stable non-coerced equilibria are possible. It seems that feels very apparent. And then the question is just how do you get there? And something like, are there traps along the way of things that sort of seem like they're in the right direction, but then you end up in, and kind of one of the classic ones of these is the sort of the feel-good hippie trap, where you're sort of like, oh, I mean, I don't coerce myself to do anything, but it's like, yeah, right, but what do you do, man? And he's like, oh, I mean, I don't know. I don't know, I just hang out a lot, or so, or I just like go to ecstatic dance, and it's like, right, but like there's like, and for some people, I think a lot of people, this will be a phase ultimately. Like people get bored, in fact, of not doing stuff, and it feels good to work. I was reading this essay the other day, Learning to Work by Virginia Valian, and it's great. She's like, I was stuck in my work and I couldn't figure out why I was stuck in my work, but I knew it wasn't this and I knew it wasn't that. And I was like, hmm. And then I read something about, I forget the title, but it's some Masters and Johnson book or essay or paper or something called like Healing Human Sexuality. And basically they posit that like sex is a natural thing for people to engage in, that they and that when people are having trouble with sex, it's because they're somehow getting in their own way. And she reads that and she goes, huh, I think that's what's going on with me and work. I think work is a natural activity, not an activity that I sort of have to should myself into, which is how I've been thinking of it so far, she notes. But actually a natural activity where I'm getting in my own way of enjoying it. And that, like the solution that the Masters and Johnson proposed with sexuality, the thing to do is to break it up into little components that are not overwhelming and stressful and beyond my capacity, and do those little pieces until I can kind of build back up. Um, which, in the sex example, involves like having couples just get really comfortable with like being naked and touching each other before without doing anything beyond just like, oh, how does that feel? Like, can they get comfortable there? Because if they can't, then yeah, doing a bunch of other stuff is going to be way too much. And likewise, it's like, can I get comfortable just like sitting with my writing setup, for instance,
Right.
just being with it? Like, can I just feel really good being like, oh yeah, here I am, I could write. Like, okay. Um, and that, yeah, as you know, this process gets overridden by school. And I think a lot of what happens to people when they set out to try to learn non self coercion or whatever is they also by habit like go too fast and end up in some other kind of attractor or something like that. where they're like, oh, I can't touch this at all. It's like, well, what about a little bit though? Like, actually, what about a little bit? And it's not like, it's finding that place where it feels good. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, the kind of I imagine here this like, I mean, the framing of of more or less coercive equilibria feels right to me,
Mm,
because rather than having this like, there's a bad coercive state, and there's the good coercive, and there's a good non-coercive state. It's like, no, there's this like vast landscape of possible equilibria, and
yeah.
like you can definitely leave whatever equilibrium you find yourself in is probably a local optimum, first of all, right? So probably
Mm,
movement in any direction is likely to be
right,
slightly,
right.
at least in some ways.
Yeah.
Uh, and then depending on how you navigate, you might end up in a worse equilibrium. You might end
Yeah.
up in a better equilibrium.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. It and the case I want to make here is not coercion is bad and you shouldn't do it. That's a paradox. Um,
Right.
uh, it's essentially, yeah, that coercion is inefficient,
Yeah.
um, and sucks,
Yeah.
and that if you are not blinding yourself to those facts insofar as they are facts,
Yeah.
you will find yourself inclined to mostly not do it.
Yeah.
But it's not there's no should there. And this is sort of part of the whole point. Like coercion and shoulds are friends. Um, um, a piece that I want to bring in because it's kind of related to the equilibria thing and so forth is my friend Trinley Goldenberg, who's done a bunch of coaching people on non-coercive motivation and stuff. He's pretty serious about having like making like you need to actually cultivate an alternate source of motivation. Like you can't simply tear down the coercive motivation or whatever. Like you have to actually cultivate desire-based motivation. And many people sort of recognize that coercive motivation is bad, and they're like, I got to stop doing that. And I had this happen to myself once. I had a weekend, over a decade ago, where I stressed myself out really bad, and then I spent all day reading a book about the precursor to the landmark forum, and then somehow my response to like, which was sort of a self-rebellion, like I had all this important stuff to do, and instead I just spent the whole day reading this book. And um okay, to get into various things there. But anyway, so I and then I sort of was like, okay, I'm gonna try just not forcing myself to do anything. Like I'm just not gonna should myself in anything at all. And so um I was like, okay, that's what I'm doing. And up until then, I'd been doing a daily journaling practice. And for those few weeks, I didn't journal. It was, one of the things I was sort of like not forcing myself that hard to do, but it was like a daily commitment, and it was one of the things that sort of got lost.
Right.
And I I ended up spending a few weeks kind of depressed. Like I somehow was still sometimes showing up for class, like I was in university at the time. Um, but I wasn't really doing any homework, and like most of what I was showing up for, I think, was not class, but like group projects. And then in the end, what kicked me out of it was Beeminder being like, "Hey, buddy, you have to write a blog post today or pay $10." And I did, and I was like, "That feels better than what I was doing." Like I was
Yeah.
sort of aimless, and I think that's probably an example of not having cultivated an alternate source of motivation. So it's like
Right.
when I sort of tried to turn off this engine, there was just deadness, and it sucked. I hated it. I did not like it. Um, and I think also maybe another way to put it, yeah, it's like because you can imagine, suppose that someone has an engine in their head where anytime they sort of think of a thing that seems worth doing, they then spin up coercion as the way to do that. They sort of spin up even very lightly. And I've lately noticed, like I've been on this kick um, of work 100 times softer.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that if I even like, I'll sit down, I'm like, all right, soft. Hmm. Yeah. Okay. What do I want to do? And I'm like really feeling into that. Like, what would feel really good to do? And then suppose I like think of what I want to do. And then I get interrupted. Maybe it's even literally just like an Amazon package gets delivered and I have to go get it. Um, and so I get interrupted and then I come back to my computer and I'm like, ah, right, yeah, this is what we're doing. And like I've lost the juicy self like flower like the sort of utterly utterly smooth motivation, friction, the sort of frictionless motivation. I've lost that. And instead I'm now attempting to complete a sort of token of a task that I came up with from this place of smoothness. Like, but I lost touch with the smoothness and now I'm doing it because that was what I intended to do 5 minutes ago. And, to-do lists in general can be a much, more intense version of this. And it's a thing that I've wrestled with a bunch sort of as a professional puzzle in the context of intend, and that whole app, which at least somewhat avoids you from a week or a month ago, you know telling today you what to do in a way that you feel out of touch with the aliveness. But you can still do it on the scale of today, right? Yeah, so I think right. So what I was saying is like if someone has that kind of every time they intend to do something, they spin up like self-flagellation, then if they try to stop self-flagellation, but they don't know how to they don't know how to like sever that link, then the only way they can do that is by not intending to do anything.
Right.
Like, and that sucks.
Yeah.
Um,
You have to like excise the process that generates new things for you to do, or excises desire.
right. As opposed to, stopping doing that thing and simply like really feeling, no, I'm free to do whatever I want.
Right. Yeah, something I'll bring in here just because it's like the thing that I woke up thinking about for some reason.
Lovely. Yeah.
Which is a beautiful essay from Brett Devereaux, who writes a collection of unmitigated pedantry. It's like my favorite history blog. But he writes about how the Romans used the word virtue and discipline in particular, so like the Latin disciplina. And the idea there was that virtue in the Roman sense is something like energy, like raw energy and courage. Whereas discipline is the thing that like contains it and channels it into a pro-social end. So like the image that you want to have in mind is like you're a Roman legionary, and your virtue, like you're in sight of the enemy. As a Roman legionary, or sorry, as like a Roman full of virtue in the Roman sense, you like can't wait to just run at the enemy. You're just filled with this like warrior spirit of like, just let me at him, let me at him, let me at him.
Mm-hmm.
But the discipline is what keeps you in your rank until your commander says like, now you can go, unleashes you.
Mm-hmm.
You can run at the enemy. And that's a very different framing of discipline. I find the way I use discipline, my friends use discipline, it's kind of like, I'm low energy, let's like stimulate ourselves to do.
Right. But if discipline is actually the thing if you understood, self-discipline as purely for restraint,
Yes.
right, then it's like, yes, the energy is supposed to come from within, like
Right.
but like but that gets at like things where it's like, okay, what drives us, right? And one of those Romans didn't have like Netflix on their phones,
Sure.
right? And it's like, you sit down to work and maybe your virtus like fires off to look at porn, right? Which is the sort of like virtus sort of means manness, etymologically, right? It fires off to look at porn. And so it's like, okay, you have to use discipline to restrain that. But then like, now what? where like you got to point your energy somewhere else, which is sort of like a different move than the Roman legionary is doing.
Yeah, that's right. The pointing, yeah, I think in the, yeah, maybe the Romans just had fewer of these like, uh, yeah, like bad channels to put your energy into or something. It's just like
Mm,
assume that you can act, assume that your energy, you can kind of assume that your energy generally ran in the right direction. And all you needed to do was like wait for it to fire in the right time at the right time.
maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
Um,
that's just an interesting alternative framing on coercion. Or like with the use of coercion, which in this case is like
yeah.
restrain energy until
And
it's ready.
I have generally found that self-commitments work way better and easier for myself. I, I can't particularly speak to other people, but way better and easier on not doing things than doing things.
Interesting.
Because if I commit to not doing something, that still leaves 99.9999999, like almost an infinite number of other things I could do. I mean, in
Right.
practice, it sort of doesn't have that many nines, but it's really it's sort of everything. Like it's like
Right.
it's like, okay, I have decided I am not going to play this one particular video game, right? It's
Right.
like that doesn't preclude me from distracting myself in other ways. I'm not trying to hem in my behavior overall. I just know that this particular video game has a way of sucking me in that I'm currently very vulnerable to. So I'm not going to open that thing.
Right.
But everything else is fair game. And it's like I've done things like that. They've worked very well. But if I try to say, okay, I'm going to every single time blah, I'm gonna blah, or every day I'm gonna blah, it's like, wow, Also because like with not doing a thing, it's really obvious if I'm about to fail because I'm about to do the thing.
Right.
With doing the thing, it's less obvious that I'm about to fail in the sense that like, if I have to do it at some point today, then and you can get into why, you shouldn't have at some point today type things as structurally whatever. It's just said me first thing after I get up, but like, okay, how first thing? Can I pee first? Right? Like anyway. Um okay. I have a few kind of pieces I want to get to. Um one of them just a few kind of yeah so I think I have a few kind of arguments to make about coercion and why it's inefficient, and I want to just kind of dive into those.
Right.
So it- yeah, so implicit to this is going to be inefficient compared to what,
Mhm.
but I think there's a way to talk about inefficiency that's not so like if you talk about the efficiency of an engine, you can measure the efficiency of two engines compared to each other, but it turns out that there's actually also something like Carnot efficiency or whatever of certain kinds of engines. I don't even know what that means, but I've heard the phrase. And more generally, you can just talk about the efficiency of an engine in percentage terms, like literally just like what, you put in raw material and you get out go. And like that raw material, we know chemically or electrically or whatever has like a certain
Yeah. Yeah.
total amount of energy to
The
it.
percentage of watts output
Right,
divided.
right.
That's
And
very
so you actually can answer it sort of purely about itself. And so I want to talk about the inefficiency that coercion has without comparing it to anything else. Because I part of the case that I'm trying to make here is that this inefficiency goes unrecognized.
yes. Great. Let's
And
talk about
so it's
that.
like I want to just, and can we quantify it? I don't intend to do that in this conversation. Like I don't even know what the units would be, but we can sort of talk about, oh, okay, here is this intrinsic to coercion inefficiency.
Great.
Um, and um, and a simple way to point at that is Goodhart. So like Goodhart's law, once a target becomes a measure, it ceases to be a good target.
Yeah.
Coercion is like, what if you took Goodhart as your motivational strategy?
Hmm.
And it needs to be that because there's an indirection between the um the source of the kind of what is going to be done and the doer of that something, whether that's internal or interpersonal.
Sure.
in other words, the consequences have been divorced from the natural consequences of doing the thing.
Yeah, I think we don't have to go down this rabbit hole yet, but my immediate reaction is kind of like, this feels like a matter of degree rather than kind. Like, how is coercion, like any action is goodhart is goodhearted in the sense of like your perception isn't perfect, and you're going to make you're going to make misperceptions. Like whatever process you use to control to like control yourself or evaluate your actions is going to have errors.
Sure. But like, suppose that I'm cleaning my dishes.
Yeah.
If I'm cleaning them because I want them clean,
Right.
then I'm asking, are they clean? And we
Yeah.
get there's various, there's various thresholds that might um achieve that, right? Maybe I just need to get the gunk off and I don't actually care if they're germ free because I'm the only one eating from them. And so there's no like, you know, I can't get myself sick that way. Like my germs will live much more happily in me than they will on this plate. So I'm not going to increase my total germ count by like only wiping off my thing and not, whatever. Um, or it might be that it's an industrial kitchen and it needs, and I want to like clean it to, whatever standards. Um, um, if by contrast, I'm cleaning my dishes because I'm supposed to clean my dishes, whether that's an internal like, oh, I should clean my dishes, like they need to be clean, but like the be clean is now a token that I need to achieve, not because I want them clean. Like I could go stand in my kitchen, look at the dirty dishes and be like, yep, I would prefer if these were clean. Like there's like a thing that I want there. Um, and I can sort of act so as to solve that. But if I'm trying to satisfy instead this like the dishes should be clean,
Yeah.
then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be satisfying. It's hard to name exactly how the thing I'm sort of referring to as like the dishes seem clean or like an image of the dishes being clean is different, but it is different. Like I would need to do the bare minimum to check off the box, which might sort of be less than the person who's trying to motivate me to do it actually wants.
Sure. Sure. Like,
Um,
yeah, the person who's motivating you to do it might, I mean, yeah, this is, simple example is like you want the dishes, what you're trying to avoid is your boss seeing dirt on the dish.
right. Um, or seeing me sort of not follow the company policy of how the dishes are supposed to be sanitized. But if he's not watching when I do it, like, and so if we measure with respect to like, the sort of again intrinsic energy efficiency, right? If we measure with respect to what the person wanted
Yeah.
versus what actually happens,
Yeah.
there's a way in which in this dish scenario we can sort of see how to the extent that I can get away with what like not fully washing the dishes in terms of what was being asked of me,
Right.
um and my only motivation is coercive.
Yeah.
It might be that I'm in a coercive situation, but also I like washing the dishes, and so I'm actually glad to wash them totally thoroughly. But then we note that my motivation to do that is not coming from coercion.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then set aside the coercion, I just go to my own kitchen, I want to wash my dishes. There's a sense in which that has 100% efficiency.
Right.
Like they get washed exactly as much as I want them washed, no more, no less. Now, if I'm conflicted about how much I want them washed, part of me is like sort of, you know, just wants to get them, bare minimum to get them out of the whatever. And another part of me like knows also to be annoyed if there's a bit of like kind of grease left on them. Right. Like I might end up like, but there I have the conflict. Like that's not the goodhart there is not in the territory. It's I haven't decided what I wanted. And so we can't assess did I achieve what I want because it's sort of undefined.
Right.
And the conflict chapter of BCP like talks about that. Like so, a person who will have two conflicting goals at the same time.
Right.
Um and and it notes a kind of inefficiency to that. So I
Okay.
want to just check, how does all that land, the sort of inherent goodhart of coercion? Um,
Yeah. I guess. Yeah. What I'm seeing here is a picture of society as an engine that converts desires into behaviors. And if we think of it that way, we're just like we have an engine, like everyone has desires, the desires are input, and then depending on how society is organized, this leads everyone to behave in a certain way. And the claim you would make is like when you say it's inefficient, you're like, well, if we have a bunch of coercion, that means we have a bunch of goodhart like behavior, which means like the efficiency of conversion from desire to behavior is low. Whereas, like, if I am totally non-coercively acting on my desire, we're going to assume, let's say, that like my behavior is 100% efficient.
mhm.
Um, and so there's no like efficiency loss. Whereas anytime you introduce a Goodhart step, you're like, oh, there's like some efficiency
Yeah.
lost here that could be used, that could have been used in like that could have been used in a fully efficient way.
Yeah. I'm noticing a little subtle question of whose efficiency is lost or something, but I want to table that because I have another thing I want to go into which feels exciting. So like in the case of something like um so we have this dishes example which feels quite sort of clear. I
Okay.
want to go back to the example of the two jobs, like the
Yeah.
one that somebody hates but they're doing because they need money to feed themselves or whatever, and the other that somebody loves, um, uh, and so they're happy to do it, and they just need also to get paid, in order to be able to keep doing it.
Right.
So because I want to investigate the question something like I like the image of like society or I wonder if there's an even better word for this, but at any rate, the collective coordination of all of humanity takes in everybody's desires and outputs some set of things that everybody is doing, right? And so there's some coordination of everybody. And this used to happen on basically only tribe scale, and we now have this giant weird thing with global markets and blah blah blah. And it's only going to get more of that, right? Um, so so I want to investigate the question of, is it even possible for 100% efficiency to be achieved with respect to not me carrying out my desire, but me carrying out your desire?
Hmm.
Like, is that even possible? Because that's there's a place where you could argue, well, that's just not going to be possible. So, we have to accept some inefficiency here.
Um, yeah, let's see. Yeah, I feel like efficiency, yeah, efficiency maybe it's a weird term to use.
Or is it
Or
possible without Goodhart?
yeah, there's something this is missing because it could actually be like efficiency assumes there's like 100% point, which is like the perfect conversion of energy. But it's like it could
Mhm.
actually be that I can do the thing that you want to do better than you can. So like that's more than 100, like the process can be more than 100% efficient from your perspective because you could just be like, Ivan, can you do this thing for me? And I
Oh,
just
oh, sure, yeah. So I'm not talking quite a yeah. So like I agree, there's a multiplier there, and that I think that turns out to be relevant and important because it might be that I can get something done for less effort by hiring someone, less effort on my part by hiring someone, even if they do a worse job, right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
So that's like, and that's an example of something where if you take energy efficiency, right? It's like driving a car is not an efficient way to get somewhere from an energy perspective unless you're like lugging a bunch of stuff, in which case like trying to jam it all onto a bike, you might have to do multiple trips and blah blah blah. But so riding a car is not in that sense efficient compared to biking. Um, but cars can still be more or less efficient. And uh something externalities, maybe we'll get to that in a bit. um But I think I have an example which I hadn't quite noticed before, but it
Okay.
feels like at least a workable starting point for um what does it mean to have intrinsic um or what does it mean to have like motivation, whether through the giant mess of society or whether just through a, two-person relationship. What does it look like for motivation to sort of transfer in a way that doesn't introduce a bunch of Goodhart?
Right.
And my sense is that it has something to do with this difference between whether somebody like hates doing the thing but is doing it because they sort of have to on some level. And of course, we gave an example of the uh sort of the capitalist version of this, right? Like the person who hates their job, but there's also a communist version of this where the person, you know, just doesn't have a choice about what job they have, I guess. They just have to work in this factory and they hate it and they don't get paid for doing it at all. But, supposedly the communist society supports them. So like that's like a different version of this. And then a close cousin to that is literal chattel slavery, um, where, you know, you're definitely not getting paid, but you're sort of, being definitely coerced into doing some stuff. So there's like some cluster of things where, the person is not intrinsically motivated, but some sort of coercion, threat, reward, punishment, whatever is like producing some behavior at some level that, has some inefficiency to it because of this Goodhart thing that we were noticing before. And also has other issues we might discuss later. Over here, we have someone who is happy to do the thing and um and who needs but who needs money to keep going, right? um so in this scenario, suppose that the uh like suppose that it's not simply that this person wants to do the thing and this person's giving them a grant because they think the thing's a good idea, but the idea came from this person. Suppose that this person has a thing they sort of want to commission to happen on some level, and they're sort of seeking out people and they find this person, they say, hey, would you love to do this? The person's like, yeah, I'd love to do this. um there's a sense in which this person is realizing this person's vision, right? So the desire is kind of flowing from this person into that person. But if this person like loves doing this work and wants to get to continue doing this work, like there's still a way in which they could get by cutting some corners,
Yeah.
but they insofar as they love doing this work, there's an extent to which they might be motivated to to deliver something that's like not just kind of the bare minimum,
Right.
but is something that will like cause the person who commissioned it to sort of rave about them and refer them to other people who might do similar things, if it's an artwork, or continue hiring them for this designer position or whatever, or like um and so you can still get a kind of loss of clarity between the one person and the other person just because something gets lost in translation, like the person doesn't quite explain what they want, and so this person goes and does something different. But that's not really what I'm talking about here in terms of inefficiency of coercion, because that can happen over here. It's sort of the communication part is kind of an aside.
Right.
um but it seems to me that like when I check in with my own experience of what it feels like to work on a team that I love to be on,
Yeah.
it generates intrinsic motivation.
Right.
And it generates intrinsic motivation not to do the things that sort of I've been told to do, but to do the things that, from my perspective, are actually what the team most needs.
Right.
Because I want that team to succeed because I love the team. I want the team to continue to want me on it because I love the team. Like and so I'm therefore using my creativity to do the thing that I think that the team actually wants. And this is now interesting because we've gotten away from what this guy wants to what the team wants. Although I guess that's partially because I just switched to my situations, which the main one I'm thinking about has felt a bit more like that.
Right.
Um, um, and I think, another great example for me is like, I can be very motivated to do stuff for for Jess, for my wife, because we're married and it feels good to support the marriage, in part because the marriage feels good. And I think
Right.
people who are in unhappy marriages are more like this scenario, like they're more like the person who doesn't like their job scenario,
Right.
where they're like, ugh, I got to do all these things, but like they don't feel the desire, they don't feel a natural desire to maintain the health of the relationship because they don't like the relationship. This is not just with marriages, but with other relationships as well.
Yeah. Um, well, so I think this centers the role. I would describe this as kind of like, yeah, you're trying to attune to the other person. Let's say it's a person rather than a team for simplicity. You're trying to
Yeah.
attune to the other person and do what it is, they actually want,
Hmm.
rather than just the like metric that they've set for you.
Hmm.
Um, and one thing I'll bracket is like, this doesn't seem actually strongly dependent on whether you're motivated by love or fear. Right? Like you could be, and often people are, I think, in situations where they're like trying to attune really hard to like an abusive partner, right? And they're not optimizing for the metric. They're optimizing for like the partner actually feeling delighted and safe and good and not angry, or something.
Yeah, I think in those situations, the person ends up with an internal inefficiency, which is that insofar as that's not simply purely what they want, but something they've kind of like spooked themselves into wanting, there will be like parts of their internal control system workings that will be trying to put the brakes on, trying to rebel in subtle ways, something like that. Um,
Um,
I can
that's
imagine this
possible.
feels like a bit of a goalpost moving, but
That could also be the case with the love motivation, right? There could be a part of you that like really is excited and wants to do this, and a part of you that's like, actually, we like, what if this person's going to betray us? Like, maybe we shouldn't attune to them. Maybe we should like make sure our resume is good. Um,
yeah, I mean, from my perspective, like, so chapter 18 of Behavior, the Control of Perception is about it talks about it in terms of control rather than or conflict rather than coercion.
yeah,
Um, but in a way, like, um, the way in which these two are linked is that if you attempt to control somebody else's behavior,
right,
you are setting up a conflict with all of the other control systems that are currently controlling their behavior.
yeah,
Um, and so unless those control systems sort of loosen, relax, cease operating, like you're going to have the gas and the brakes on at the same time. Um,
right,
and you can, a very literal example of this is suppose that somebody's driving to go somewhere and they realize that they're running a bit late.
yeah,
Then they might start speeding up, but then the control system that says don't break the speed limit or not by too much kicks in, and then they slow down a bit, and then they're like, oh shit, I'm late, and they speed up again. They're like, oh, but I can't speed, and they slow down again. And either they end up in an oscillation or they end up slightly faster than they feel comfortable with while also still going to be late.
right.
And they're like, and the chapter talks about how, you end up with this like
That zone, yeah,
this dead zone, right? Where you even can't even control what you're doing there, which feels to me like a different kind of inefficiency,
yeah,
right? A kind of lack of control of the actual situation, which I
right.
think is different than the Goodhart thing. Um,
that does feel like that does feel like a different thing.
And I think compromise, like one way to frame that is compromise. You've averaged things in a way that has compromised in the other sense both original goals. Like you've compromised achieving the whole goal. Like it's
Yeah. I think one thing that's worth bringing, one variable I want to introduce here, which feels critical, is time. So efficiency, like the units of efficiency in energy, right, is like how much power is transmitted per unit, or how much energy is transmitted per unit time, right? Watts are like energy per second, I believe.
mm-hmm.
And so that feels critical to add here, because the reason people do Goodhart is because it's cheaper in time and communication cost, which another way to say communication cost is time, I think, because that's usually the bottleneck. And so I think the way in which coercion clearly seems efficient in many circumstances, and why it's so widespread,
Mm-hmm.
is because per unit time, it's often the best way to coordinate.
Yeah, I mean,
Or if you disagree with that.
the I I like your point. I mean, I think there's a thing that needs to be addressed here, which is something like, given that coercion has these issues,
Yeah.
um, why is it still getting used?
Well, and that's and I guess my hypothesis, my leading hypothesis right now is it's literally just like more efficient in the sense of per unit time. Like
Yeah,
there's military
which I think gets back to something like, the way in which a car is less efficient than a bicycle, but it will get you there faster, right?
exactly.
Like, um, and so then the question becomes something like, can, vehicles that run on a, desire-based motivation engine,
Yeah.
be made that are as large as the vehicles that have been made, as large and as fast as the vehicles that have been made out of coercion and like engine. Does that feel like kind of the question?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good metaphorical way to put it. Another way to say it is like, I noticed that, um, have you read the planetary scale vibe collapse
Yeah,
essay?
yeah, I love that piece.
Yeah, me too. But essentially, yeah, one way to interpret that piece is like, before, in the ancestral environment, we were operating on attunement based. We were
Mhm,
operating on attunement, essentially.
mhm.
We had this like attunement based operating system where everyone just like relied on vibes to understand each other and like smoothly flow without any sense of like individual identity, without any like coercion or deception being necessary,
Yeah,
at least within a tribe.
yeah,
Obviously, coercion still happens between tribes.
yeah.
And like, we can ask, well, what happened to that system? And the answer is it was outcompeted. Like,
Yes, yes,
people got murdered
yes.
or colonized.
Well,
Uh,
right. It was
I,
outcompeted in two senses. One of which is that other cultures were developed that like some other, pockets of local culture
yeah,
outcompeted within a tribe, and it became a new way of doing things. And then the tribes that were doing things that new way outcompeted other tribes. But when you look into this, and Andrew Cutler has a bunch of great stuff on this about cultural diffusion. Um, when you look into this, it's really clear that what didn't happen is the first group to invent, uh, I self-reference, um, coercion, that kind of stuff. That group didn't simply obliterate everybody else. They actually spread that technology to other tribes who have diverse genetic lineages. But and so this is actually even sort of it's an interesting, and then indeed the ones who did not adopt it did get out competed. Like that did also happen, but the point is it didn't, that's not the only way that it spread like
yeah, yeah,
laterally, not just via dominating.
yes,
It's like it spread mimetically. um and so And so it's like, okay, we had this coercive culture that outcompeted this previous uh, liminal vibey culture in two different ways, like both
Yes.
mimetically and physically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the two are related in that, like, yeah, I think the two are related in that it's just a like patterns that coordinated using the new coercive based
Mhm,
coordination strategy were just like, and I don't know if the right word is dominant here, but like, yeah, they're more effective
mhm.
at, they're more fit, both like mimetically and physically.
Yeah. So I want to, so something that you may not have been assuming about me, I don't know, is that I'm like 100% with you on this. Like this is
Okay. Good.
exactly my model. Um and I and has been for over a decade.
Cool.
Um broadly. I didn't have that particular article at that time, but I had other similar articles that were sort of looking at this shift of the invention of coercion and it having kind of outclassed this earlier mode of being. Um and I really like the analysis in the planetary scale vibe collapse um, piece, which, by the way, just briefly talking to YouTube here, I will put links to most of the things that we've been talking about down in the thingy. Um, so part of what I like about that piece is that it highlights the extent to which, yeah, we can't go back because the thing that we were before is clearly unstable on contact with this new thing. So, given that, what does forward look like? Like, and um, and the project as I have been conceiving of it for again over a decade has been fundamentally to create a thing that has this capacity for liminality, vibing, non-duality, attunement, uh, desire-based motivation. Like we could talk about it in a bunch of ways, but to create a thing that has that as
Right.
its core
Yeah.
and is more efficient than or is otherwise able to outcompete the coercive
Yes.
mode. Like that is the whole project. I like that we've gotten here. And because yeah, that's central to the whole thing. So it's not that, yeah, like there is a mode of collaboration that coercion clearly does outcompete.
Right.
Um, and the only argument you can make, which is a um an attractive but completely useless argument. The only argument you can make for the old thing, like the thing that got out competed, is it was nice. This
Right.
is less nice. I would like this would feel better, right? Like this is sort of obvious, but it's no good, right? Um, so having said that, the fact that this other way of being feels better is a a a one of the reasons why it has the new thing will also feel better. That's sort of definitionally true to it. It's a part of the thing that we're aiming for is a new thing that feels better, that like feels wholesome, feels like non-self-conflicted, etc. And that is one of the things that makes it have evolutionary fitness relative to the coercive thing. But it's clearly not insufficient.
Right. Actually, yeah, let me maybe make a what if the opposite is true somehow? Which is to say that like I think Nietzsche talks about this in Beyond Good and Evil, where he's like the European soul, basically due to the progress of Christianity or Protestantism or something, he
Mhm.
visualizes like the European soul as being under an incredible amount of tension because we've like Protestantism, especially Calvinism, like kind of internalizes all the tension and all the self-coercion. It makes you like your inner cop.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so you're under this incredible inner conflict, which feels really bad. You're under so much tension. But then he's like, that tension is like the tension of a bow, which allows you to fire an arrow much further. And so this would be, there's some kind of claim here, which is like the inner conflict that doesn't feel, that is the thing that doesn't feel nice, is precisely the thing that makes it competitive.
Yeah.
Like if that's true, that would be a death blow to the project, I think.
I I mean, unless there were, a bow is only one way to uh projectile, right? Like maybe there's a catapult or something that like trebuchets have a very like loosey goosey kind of vibe, right? Not that this matters, but like they're
I
like
think there's still a lot of tension, but yeah.
right, like um and so it's like they come at us with bows, but we come at them with trebuchets, like
Yeah, yeah,
um
yeah. That's true. That's true. It's just because we discovered one way to get to like extract a ton of labor out of the human psyche
yeah,
doesn't mean it can't be equally good ways. Yeah.
yeah. Um, Another thing that is salient to me is, and I don't think we're going to be able to get to the bottom of all of this today. Like there's so much of it, right? But I am really keen to sync up with you about this because it relates to like what are the impacts of increasing coordination of different kinds on humanity. Um, the part of what I want to highlight is that coercive motivation is amoral. And this is a very uncomfortable thing to point out to the Calvinists. Like, but you can sort of whip people into doing all sorts of things. Like you can coerce them into doing all sorts of things. And I think you noted this maybe like about in your enforcement draft, like the enforcement attunement draft. Um, like if your sense of what is good is to follow the rules, it's you know, like you're the one driving the trains in Nazi Germany, um, or whatever else.
Yeah.
And um, and so it's like motivation that like there's a piece of propaganda that comes from I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. It shows up in Christianity and many other places, but it shows up in Christianity as early as Paul, I think, like in the year 90 or whatever. But like I'm not sure I'm not sure what roots of it come from like directly what Jesus said or whatever. And then um and then certainly this idea gets picked up um by Augustine in his Confessions and um by the Calvinists and whatnot. But the piece of propaganda goes basically without the fear of God, everyone would be totally immoral. And so unless
Well,
you
the animal nature is base and
right,
sinful.
right. And so unless you coerce yourself, you will like be you'll be a slave to your passions is like one way they put it. You'll be you will do evil, blah 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 blah.
Right.
And ironically, as far as I can tell from the stuff I've read and investigated about this is not animal nature. Whatever the thing is that generates evil, it ain't the animal. You look around at other animals and they kill, they whatever, but they don't deliberately torture by and large. It's not really a thing that shows up in the animal kingdom. Maybe there's some exception, but I'm not aware of it. And so it's not an ordinary animal activity in any case. Um, they don't torture, they don't sort of exploit, they don't they don't do greed. The squirrel stockpiles as much nuts as they need for the winter and then stops,
Right.
with some margin of error or whatever, right? Like, so, um, they don't do greed. They don't do, they definitely don't do lust. They just, have sex when that's time to have sex. I mean, you could argue that bonobos do lust, but doesn't seem to be causing them any problems. Um, they don't like have lust as a vice that sort of causes them to. I mean, I guess like, in other primate hierarchies, maybe lust causes destabilization of their hierarchy, whatever, but like not to the same degree. It doesn't. Anyway, point is, it's not the animal, right? It's not where that thing comes from. Um, and and so there's a question of where it does come from, and I don't have a short answer to. I feel like I sort of understand that, and some of Andrew Cutler's work goes into this as well. But the there's dualism certainly seems to be part of it. The sense of the creation of the separate me who can then sort of want arbitrarily much of something. Like I can get a concept in my head of having arbitrarily much of something, and then I can get myself to think that if I achieve that, then that will get me what I want. Um, Neurologically, it's like the more general control system basis of the brain that sort of is like trying to satisfy basic desires or something doesn't generate those. Um, anyway, I've gotten way far afield here. Propaganda, the idea being that like if you give into your base desires, you will do bad things. And people know that there's some truth to this in the sense that they manage to use discipline, sort of restraint or whatever, to keep themselves from looking at porn, let's say, is just an example of a sort of base desire gone weird. Um, and they know that there's some amount of letting themselves do that would be self-destructive, right? But it's already self-destructive. Like, you don't need fear of God to not want to look at porn. You can just note it's self-destructive. Like, I just note. I mean, that makes it sound very easy, but the point is, like, insofar as it's causing problems, it is causing problems for you. Like, it's not um you don't need threat of punishment at some other time and place for that to be true. And the threat of punishment at some other time and place could also tell you all sorts of other things. Like,
Yeah. I mean, this might get too deep into theology, but like I'm a fan of Wolf's conception of the Abrahamic God as like a token that stands in for the real reality, what is actually real, like beyond your own mind and your own conscious understanding and even the social understandings that you've received. And in that sense, to say that like fear of God is what prevents your animal nature is kind of like uh, it just stands in for like, remember that you don't understand all the consequences of your actions. And
well,
we're going
right.
to
And
tell
so,
you these things that God wants you to do when God said, when like the Ten Commandments, right, are basically like reminders about features of reality.
yeah.
Uh,
And so the thing that I would note is that they're not presented as such. I'm quite sympathetic to the conception that you just referred to, but the way that it's presented projects the punishing parent, which would
yes,
have been a feature of early coercive society, a new feature of early coercive society, and it projects the punishing parent onto reality,
right.
which we now know is false. Like,
Yeah.
we in the sense of like we've gotten enough outside of how we've understood enough of how reality works that we can confidently say it does not punish you. And by not
Well,
punish you, what I mean is like, shall I finish, or do you want to say your?
I want to say it's hyper it's hyperstitioned, I would say, right? Like if you're a Jew in like 1 AD, I think you would in fact find that reality was quite punitive towards transgression. That's because your society would
Oh,
know.
the social reality. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's
Um,
like they
yeah,
hyperstitioned a punishing universe, a punishing parent into existence.
right.
We could hyperstition something else.
But if you take like the Cain and Abel story,
Yeah.
we're going full biblical here.
Yeah.
They both make their offerings to God,
Yeah.
and something goes well for Abel, I think, and something goes poorly for Cain. And Cain interprets that as an unfair parent punishing him and
Yeah.
gets bitter and kills his brother.
Right.
And um and if you instead interpret it as they both made an offering, and either they're actually something about the nature of how they were conducting their lives was such that, the one worked and the other didn't, or just random chance, the rain fell on this valley this year and not on that valley. Like, but either way, like, things sort of just happened, and then the projection of the authority onto that.
Okay.
Like, that's an example where it's not a social punishment. It was a projection onto the non-social reality as being punishing. The Noah flood thing is similar, although that's I don't even want to go. I don't want to go there. Um, but it's like we now have, like, when punishment had first been invented, it would be easy to think that maybe it was a feature of all of reality. In fact, you could project punishment onto reality, and reality certainly does respond to you and give you consequences. Like, in the very literal sense, you do something, something happens as a result. You plant a tree, well, you get fruits. You punch someone, they punch you back, or you fail. Let's say you fail to sort of secure your house against a flood, and then it gets flooded or whatever. So, like, you do things, you get consequences. You can project punishment onto that,
Right.
but this is a thing you are doing. And
Right.
if you stop doing it, you notice that in a in a deep way, it's more true that reality does not punish you.
Right.
Um, Not just a different way of viewing it, but a more accurate way of viewing it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
This makes a lot of sense, and it's interesting. It connects with I've been studying the early history of science, especially in England in like the 16th, 17th century. And one of the weird things about the scientific project there, oh, I mentioned this in my essay on the root of all evil, where it's like the early scientists, starting with Francis Bacon onwards to Newton, etc., they actually like the scientific project was funded quite lavishly by the monarchy and by like miscellaneous noblemen and aristocrats
Mhm.
for hundreds of years before it yielded any actual tangible good results. Right? And these
Mm.
people were like studying reality, uh, like these were like noblemen who could do anything they wanted with their lives. Most of their peers were out like hunting pheasants or like, I
Yeah.
don't know, going to cool parties. And
Yeah.
these guys were like stuck in smelly laboratories, like measuring the exact amount of like weird chemical paste that you put
Yeah.
into
Because they had to know.
because they had to know. But well, what was their motivation exactly? And certainly in Bacon, I don't know how widespread this was. You get this idea that well, God is loving, right? So like God loves humanity and wants humanity to be better. And so, and God created nature for us.
Mhm.
So like we need to understand what this nature thing is. And we're confident that the thing that we're going to discover is going to be good for us because
Mm.
like God is loving. And so we need to
Interesting.
like, so this is a way of saying like, instead of projecting this is a natural consequence of what happens when you start projecting love onto the universe
Mhm.
instead of projecting punishment.
Yeah. And there's a better case to be made for projecting love onto the universe than punishment. It's still complex, and you have to operational. What exactly do you mean? But um, it's yeah. Or rather, a better case for love being an inherent aspect of the universe and not merely a projection.
Right.
Um, but
But,
it's a
but
complex
at the
case.
very least, it encourages bringing this back to like coercion versus attunement.
Yeah.
It encourages attunement to the universe. It's like the thing that
Yeah.
you believe the universe is loving in this complicated way that you gestured at. Then your imperative is to attune to it rather than like to avoid being punished by it, which is very
Right.
different.
And you attune to it because you're curious about it and how it loves you, and you want it to know you so it can love you better, or you want to know it so you can love it so it can love, like, it's not that you have to, it's that it feels good, it feels right, it naturally draws. Um so where are we? Let's see. This is good. I think there's want to trace a thread from somewhere about the the Abrahamic God as standing in for real reality, the propaganda piece, and um how it's like, yeah, that we studied, like we know enough about the cosmos to be pretty confident that that projection of there being an agent who is punishing us um is not accurate. And um so and moreover, when we think about some of the church maxims in general, like part of why these images feel realistic, and part of the extent to which you can't use this type of propaganda, it's harder to get this type of propaganda to get people to do totally arbitrary things.
Yeah.
The reason for that is it's hard to buy. Like if I said, oh, if you don't put 14 chickens on your lawn every Tuesday, then like you know you will surrender to the urge of um like waxing your eyebrows with painful wax, and you're just like, I think I wouldn't though, right? Like this sort of no, like not, it's not just the causality of that per se, but it's like I don't have an urge to wax my, like that would suck, and I
Right.
simply wouldn't do it. But there are other things that suck, and that for whatever reasons we do have impulses to do them or whatever. Um, and so part of why this propaganda works is that it appeals to a relative truth, which is, oh yeah, I do have urges in that direction, but then it does, and I know it causes problems.
Right.
Um, which, oh, and another thing that would be silly is like if you don't put 14 chickens on your, or if you don't restrain yourself, you might accidentally cook yourself a nice meal. You might give into your temptation to cook yourself a nice meal, and you're sort of sitting there going, and what would the problem be of that? Like it's sort of like that doesn't hit, because you know that, like, yeah, I am sometimes tempted to cook myself a nice meal, but nothing goes wrong when I do, right? Like it's like
Right.
um and so there already needs to be some recognition on the person's own part of the issues that would be caused. And you can get into stuff about like early culture and how the cultural knowledge and wisdom encoded knowledge that no individual had. Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success um, is a book that talks a bunch about that, and is part of why people simply did what culture said sort of without understanding it, and why it was necessary for them to do that, because culture had evolved knowledge that no individual had, in the same way that like squirrels probably on some level don't know why they're storing nuts, they just know they have an urge to store nuts right now. um Likewise, it's like humanity stored a bunch of those things in shoulds, and so
Right.
there's a need to be careful as we deconstruct our sense of should. um but we're at a phase where we kind of can't not, like we can't afford to not come into conscious relationship with all of them. And even where we have things where we're like, oh, like where we have old superstitions and we're like, we don't understand what that superstition was about, but maybe we should obey, listen to Chesterton's fence notion and not get rid of it precisely because we don't know why it's there. But for
Right.
other ones, we know why they're there, and so we can let them go, like maybe, right? I mean, we have had a lot of hubris about this before. So, but like, with sufficient humility, there's we can try experiments. Oh, can we let this go? Oh, yeah, okay. Um,
Right.
but the point is that that all comes from, yeah, like freedom, essentially, like, and from the recognition of freedom, um, which I really like Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism is a humanism. There's a talk on he has a book with that title, but I've only read a talk transcript. But in it, he highlights the utterly inalienable freedom that everybody has, which I think is another way to point at the thing that's confused about coercion, is that coercion tends to ally with the idea that someone is not free, when in part because it's actually quite hard to coerce somebody purely via physical force. Like
Right.
you either need to like, or purely via threat of force.
Right.
It works a lot better if the threat of force scares them into thinking, I have to do this, as
Right.
opposed to, I have to do this or I'll get beaten.
Right.
Because then if you're having the second thought, you can go, I have to do this or I'll get beaten, or I could run away.
Right.
And if I got caught, I'd get beaten. But if I did this, then you start to actually start looking at your situation.
Right.
And so I have to do this without an actual consequence attached, which is how in practice a lot of coercion necessarily functions, because when it actually reveals the consequence, people are more willing to just bite the bullet and take the consequence, or they become more aware of their opportunity to leave. Coercion necessarily participates in generating the illusion of not freedom. Which I guess, anyway, this is just another point I wanted to get to about the inefficiency of coercion, which is also sort of related to the cultural propaganda or that kind of thing.
Yeah. And that feels to me like I don't find that argument against coercion terribly compelling, because it's like, maybe it's like we've actually developed very good coercive technologies and patterns of coercive behavior that like generally avoid these downsides.
Really?
Well, I mean, there's like systemic downsides that are like hard to track. But yeah, I think we're very good at like pushing the bugs in that process out to like the side where no one pays attention to them, right? So it's just like, yeah, in fact, like 1% of the US population is imprisoned right now. And that's kind of like crazy, like literally being held against their will
Yeah.
in cages.
Yeah.
And like actually very few of them escape. Like we actually don't give them, we've managed to physically not give them the option of escaping, which is also crazy.
Well,
And
if I mean, okay, so but if we take the prison example, I would still say that like probably people would like when people there's probably a thing I don't know all the details of this, but my impression is that whether people um well, recidivism, like whether people commit more crimes when they get out, may have something to do with the extent to which they freely reflect on what happened while in jail versus sort of feel like they're in, oh, I have to be, I'm um, but that I don't even want to go there. I want to go to, uh, I want to go to so something you said, searching for the root of the tree of evil, attainment and enforcement. Um, Hang on. I'm free to do whatever I want. You said we pushed it out to the margins. Um, it's hard to name exactly why I think this is connected here, but let me see if I can do it. The idea that we're over coordinated. And what was I saying about freedom?
coercion implicitly
Yeah,
allies.
so it seems to me that the thing that you refer to there as over coordinated,
Yeah.
um, is um citing, I think, Richard Nyo, yeah, our friend. Um, the thing that you refer to there as over coordinated, it seems to me, is precisely a function of having swept our own freedom under the rug.
Hmm.
So there is a bunch of have tos that we are successfully coordinating,
Yeah.
and then we wonder, why is it so bad? And it's like, why can't we do something different? It's like, in part because we have convinced ourselves that we can't. Like we are telling ourselves, oh, but I have to do this, or what?
Right.
Like, and we've sort of lost touch with that freedom. So this is not an argument, but it's a statement of, it seems to me that those are like, the one is the engine powering the other. Like,
Yes. Yeah. Maybe my disagreement is more like it's not like, I don't think the problem is that we forget how free we are. I think the problem is that like our institutions are actually good at setting up our choices in such a way as to make submission the submission, the dominant choice. It's a weird phrasing.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, I think that some of these like in terms of going back to the transition between um which I see us as already in for what it's worth, between the coercive culture that came after the liminal culture, the transition from that into some new, more fit uh liminal non-dual collaborative culture.
Yeah.
So that transition that ICS is in, and that, you know, science is one big piece of how we came to be in that, but also, like, you know, Jesus's like recognition of forgiveness is like a piece of that trend. You know, it's like a bunch of like figuring out, like,
Right.
now that we've invented selves and self-reference and the possibility of coercion, how do we invent social tech so that we don't have to do that? Ironically, like, so, you know, so that we have something better, in fact. um and in that transition, like, it seems to me that there are going to be um a number of points when the tipping point involves something like unionization, like a bunch of people managing to coordinate and band together to be like, no, we're not going to do this,
Right.
and you can't divide and conquer us this way, something like that. Um, no, by which I don't mostly mean literal unions. I actually think that, like, literal unions will mostly not solve the employment things. Like, you need other stuff. It's going to look more like people building companies with really wholesome cultures that, um, because of the efficiency gains of people loving working for them and whatever, outcompete the other things. Which, you know, we haven't gotten to the bottom of that either. Um, but anyway, but more like, yeah, people banding together to just be like, no, we are like, you know, like, you can imagine even today, just with the internet, a like a sort of civil disobedience petition
Yeah.
that's like, gets, you know, millions of signatures in some country, where it's like basically people agreeing, if, you know, a million other people sign this, then I will, you know, not abide by this stupid law, right? And then that just gets a million signatures, and everybody's just told, all right, now's the moment. They're not going to put all of us in jail. They're not going to fine all of us. They can't. Like, bam. Like, I'm actually honestly surprised nobody's tried that yet. I haven't. I would have expected to see it by now, so I may be missing something.
Right. I
Um,
mean, some of the Arab Spring protests kind of had this, or revolutions kind of had this vibe, right? Of like,
yeah,
social media was used to create common knowledge that like
that
a million
every
people would in fact be on the streets
yeah,
and police would be overwhelmed.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, so I feel quite good with where we've come today in terms of like what can be done in an hour and a half or so of talking. Um, and I feel a sense of this being a more ongoing, like, dialogue. I mean, between you and I, but between everybody. But it's like, I can imagine a sequel conversation to this one that would look something like, so how, like, what does the alternative look like? Like, actually starting to flesh that out a bit more. Like, what, you
Yeah.
know, what are the types of motivation that show up on different scales? What are the types of coordination that are used to kind of organize those motivations and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, kind of exploring that. Um, I want to create space for, insofar as the, you know, the topic of today's thing is about inefficiency. I want to just, like, yeah, take, you know, a few minutes, maybe up to 15, and kind of like, is there anything, are there loops there that feel insufficiently closed? What did either of us learn or kind of come to appreciate about each other's perspectives? What are the things that still feel open and unresolved? Um,
Yeah. My intuition is that there's like a cybernetics or computational model of coordination that is like too vague in both of our minds for us to really get at the crux
Hmm.
of our disagreement. And I think we got close to it when you're describing kind of your model of like efficiency of like desire is imperfectly converted into behavior
Hmm.
via like Goodhart.
Hmm.
And then we also touched on it. We were talking about like efficiency over time, right? Like sometimes coercion is just the most effective way. If you have to make a decision now, the best thing I can do is be like, Malcolm, like do this right now or I'll kill you. Like there may not be a better uh or it wouldn't be the case with you, obviously, because I know you
Right.
presumably trust me. But like if it was a stranger who had no reason to trust me, that might in fact be the best way to achieve some outcome. Uh
Maybe.
maybe.
I mean, like, I think in
But
practice, if you want to get a stranger to do something, an
yeah.
urgent plea is more likely to work than a threat because they're more likely to just run away from the threat.
Yeah, it
Right,
depends.
right, which gets at part of the thing here. It's like in order to properly coerce someone, you need a shocking amount of control, and like,
Right.
or you need to trick them, right?
Yeah,
Like, you
right.
know,
Right. Um, yeah. I guess, yeah, I'd like to maybe, yeah, my sense is like the if I were to lay out the research agenda here, it's kind of like, can we characterize in a clear way why it was that like the coercive pattern won out over the ancestral vibe-based coordination pattern?
mm-hmm.
Like, can we describe like why did it win exactly? Because it was more efficient given these constraints of the environment, or given the fact that it could coordinate larger groups of people, or maybe it was like better at war but not at flourishing, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I feel like if we could develop and align on a model of that, which I think would expand on like the behavior control and perception chapter that we've been discussing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Yeah, I think if I had a clear statement of like, yes, given these assumptions, vibe-based consciousness was better. Given these assumptions, coercion-based coordination was better. Um, that would sort of like that would provide the illumination we need to design the like new synthesis. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and without it, I kind of feel I feel, yeah, like this tension that like, we haven't gotten to the crux. We haven't gotten to the crux of the
Yeah,
issue.
yeah, yeah. And there can be a like it, and it's easy for something to come off as kind of a straw man of coercion, right? Like kind of like um not not recognizing that evolutionarily
Right.
it um it worked, right? Like it worked and continues to work to the extent that it continues to work. Um and um Oh, one piece I wanted to name that I thought of a few minutes ago was in terms of like, efficiency and control and other stuff. You kind of, I think, the other day mentioned something about the idea of like a law of conservation of conversion of coercion. And my sense is that we might be seeing, I mean, I don't know how you'd even quantify, but like whether or not it's conserved, we might be seeing like a few particular forces pulling it down at the same time other forces pull it up,
Yeah.
and like increased capacity for surveillance and monitoring of citizens, for instance, means greater uh like greater reach of the government to do certain of the government, let's say, to do certain kinds of coercion. It also sort of means greater reach of like, employers can install things on their employees' computers that like, check for mouse wiggles or whatever. And then of course the employees just buy a fucking mouse wiggler. Right. It's like so, all of the like which again gets at like what does it mean to work efficiently, right? So there is some sort of greater reach that is increasing and allows certain kinds of maybe coercion that weren't happening before. Even just like the monitoring of what people are doing so you can enforce tax evasion or I don't know, whatever. Um, so while at the same time other dimensions of coercion are decreased from hundreds of years ago in the form of like people having more different kinds of work opportunities, right? Rather than being stuck in a single opportunity. And, people being able to work from home and therefore not be sort of coerced by their boss into various circumstantial things, or people having more opportunities for education and reading. And it's different types of like there's sort of increased freedom and increased control in different ways. I forget what I wanted to say about that, but so this relates to the thing about coercion being maybe more efficient or more kind of easily deployable in a short-term thing.
Yeah,
It's like that becomes more true the extent to which you have more of certain kinds of technology.
right.
Because like, if you want someone to do your bidding and they're on the other side of the country, like hundreds of years ago, you had to hope they wanted to do your bidding, right? But now you can call them and you can monitor them and you can get them to have deliverables every single day or every single hour if you want, right? From the other side of the country, right? So there's like yeah. Um,
Yeah, and this is maybe why I no longer believe in the kind of naive techno-optimist, or like the ideology of the internet,
mhm.
which was kind of like, oh, we'll just connect everyone and higher bandwidth will make everyone better off, because like what we naturally want to do is like coordinate and we all get more of what we want. And I'm like, that's true up to a certain margin, but I think if something like the law of conservation of coercion holds true, even if it only holds true in our current cultural environment,
Right, then
then
that would still be like uh yeah. Um, yeah. Cool. Well, yeah, I like that research agenda, and I like the idea of having more conversations like this one to hash some of this out. And maybe there's also more kind of research to do, and like devising like a document or some sort of something.
yeah, maybe my last question for you is like, what do you feel like is the best lab for studying this? Because we kind of walked through a bunch of examples. Some of them were political, some of them were like Christian Bibles, like Christian stories.
Right.
Some of them were more personal. Like, what is the like drosophilia or the E. coli of like
What
understanding
was the first example?
drosophilia, like the standard fruit fly that
Oh
everyone.
yeah, Joseph. Yeah, yeah. Just didn't hear it right.
Yeah, kind of what are you orienting to in your environment, or in the world that feels like this is where I need to study. This is where like I will really learn the truth about coercion.
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of self um self experimentation lately with this. One of the one of the things that our current um society affords, let me see if I can pull in this example very quickly. So Buddhism went through multiple phases, and like sort of Theravada, Mahayana, whatever. And some people have posited that I think I got this from Ken MacLeod. I don't think this is widely agreed, but the reason Mahayana came about, which had the Bodhisattva and so forth, not just the monk. Like Theravada was all just Buddhism means become a monk, and then something like 500 years later, you get um, uh, bodhisattvas and this other modes of practicing Buddhism. Um, and Ken MacLeod theorized that part of why this came about was that trade had produced a wealthy merchant class
Mm.
who had time to meditate and didn't want to become monks. Whereas previously, you were either a farmer or you noped out of that and became a monk, but there was no way to like get the space for leisure without becoming a monk who begged for alms.
Right.
Um, and so there was no market demand for a Buddhism that would cater to people like that because there approximately weren't any. 500 years later, you've got the merchant class and they want that. And so I do think that the increased like the fact that there are so many more people who have found a way to, you know, um, have relative sort of logistical freedom in their life now, like the merchant class of that time, um, but it's, it's through having some little whatever business, or like working from home relatively efficiently, or whatever the thing is, means that there's a lot more people testing out testing out these ideas on their own, like making little microcultures of what does it feel like to not coerce myself, and sort of having the space to do so. Even just working from home affords a kind of distance from your boss, where even if your boss is trying to coerce you, you can still be like, but no, though, I'm going to do the work I think is good, and you will either like it and we'll keep working together, or you won't and I will leave because I like, but you don't have to sort of directly deal with them in your face so much. Anyway, um so personally, yeah, my petri dish has been my me. And dialogues with Jess and with other people that I'm close to, and sort of experimenting with that. And uh recently, Michael Smith and I hosted this um gathering to basically experiment with combining circling and original spin, or
Mhm.
unwinding original spin. So we sort of walked people through a few steps of recognizing the difference between their mind and their animal, and then um, we went into doing kind of a circling type conversation of like dropping into the present moment, um, but with the specific energy towards noticing and releasing original spin whenever it showed up. And That was really cool. Like it was like, oh yeah, this is happening live for people. They're recognizing how their motivation is getting whatevered. So this is not a this is I don't know if your Drosophilia E. coli question was intended to be in relation to the like researching how the coercive pattern won out over the ancestral vibe-based pattern. I mean, that one's hard to study because there just aren't instances of the ancestral one available anymore. If there were, and you could find them, somebody else would have found them by now and made them not that. Um, which is not true as of like 80 years ago. Like there were still pockets of tribes around the world that had not been like bushwhacked into by like Western investigators. And the planetary scale vibe collapse post heavily cites one such anthropologist who did a bunch of that in a few different continents. Um, so yeah, so some of that has to be studied via reading about these anthropological reports. I've put a tiny bit of effort into trying to find his video footage. He has like 40 hours of video footage of these people, right? Like that would teach you something. Um, but yeah, there's also, to some extent, perhaps, like there's a question of how much we've actually biologically evolved since then. Um, and I initially had assumed it was not much, but actually, the selection pressures have been quite different since the advent of coercion.
Yeah.
Both selecting more for people who are coercible, whatever that means, to some extent, or maybe or something, but also like selecting more for like having a self at all, like just the ability to have a sense of self that does that self-reference loop. Um, and so that, I, I used to think that given the right environment, we could obviously go back, like biologically, that like if I were raised in that ancient society, and I still think that's basically true. But anyway, where am I going with this? Compress, conclude. Yeah, I mean, I've mostly been exploring it in my own personal petri dish, and with a bit of like reasoning from something like first principles. It's like, oh yeah, that would structurally outcompete that, and you can just sort of tell by making a toy model of it. Um, but Yeah,
That makes sense. No, I think that seems like the that seems like a good place to start. I guess I yearn for like a simpler environment or something, a less like self-recursive environment,
yeah. I
right?
mean, like you could try to make little agents and see which ones, like how to create evolutionary environments where they collaborate,
Yeah.
or like
Axelrod experiments in the evolution of cooperation. Yeah,
yeah,
that kind of thing.
like a first principles type thing.
Yeah, that also doesn't feel satisfying somehow, but
Right.
or
And you
just
get very different things depending on a bunch of assumptions, right? And all of which are going to be so far from humanity, right?
unlike the drosophilia example, which is like, yeah, you actually study, like there's this real fly out in the world
yeah.
that you can precisely study and
Yeah.
understand the
Oh,
microstructure.
another example. I want this is why I started talking. I have such a branching mind. This is why I started talking about the evolutionary thing. But kids,
Yes.
like, I'm as you know, I'm becoming a dad in some number of weeks.
Right.
Um and some small number of weeks. And um, my daughter is going to be born uncoerced
Right.
and then is then going to encounter
Yeah.
both forces that will try to coerce her
Yeah.
and forces that will like try to attune with her and like find win-wins and invite her into play that she also is then drawn into, or work that she's then also drawn into, you know um noting that work is also a natural like thing. And you can see toddlers get industrious, they're like, oh, I want to bang this thing, or like there's like a um or like get industrious about learning a new skill. So I think yeah, that I think actually in a way a baby human is like a not a bad like uh drosophilia equivalent,
Right.
right, in terms of understanding like like having an instance of a being encountering the forces of coercion and
Right.
collaboration.
I'm excited. I'm excited to for you to be go on that journey and for yeah, and for us to discuss kind of the things that come up with that. I've been
Mhm.
reading. I occasionally read various like parenting articles. This is one of the key arguments that parents get into on the various like parenting forums. And
Totally. Yeah.
yeah, is like, when is coercion okay? When is punishment okay? Is it ever okay? And
Mhm.
like, yeah, very different opinions.
Yeah.
And yeah, no consensus in sight.
Yeah. And I, to the best of my ability, and which is partially just my ability to uh, pay attention to track all this stuff. My aim is to not try to ask it in terms of, is it okay? Is it not okay? Like that's already the wrong frame. The question is, well, what are the effects of it? What are the alternatives?
Right.
Like that's it, and to not shy from whatever the effects in fact are.
Right.
Like, if you punish your kid, effect, they will hide consequences from you that they think you will punish them for.
Right.
Full stop. Like that is a inherent fact of how punishment works. Like, does that mean it's okay? Well, up to you. How much hiding do you want your kid to do? Like, how much is that trade-off worth the other things, right? And so in that way, you're not trying then to stop yourself from punishing, even though it feels like punishment's the way to do it, right? Like, because that's its own trap, right? Instead, it's just like, okay, how much can I keep my eyes open to the effects of this? Which is not just about like presence, but it's also about actually modeling the system dynamics. Um, like, because if you don't model the system dynamics, then you get like people trying to follow the Sermon on the Mount because Jesus said it, not because like, oh yeah, if you do that, it does do that, which I don't like. Which then, yeah, I want to do like you don't sort of close the loop on understanding why it, whatever's. So
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm reminded of like the still counterintuitive and probably mostly wrong finding in social science of like parenting just not mattering very much for how a child develops and peer effects mattering a lot more. And I wonder
mm,
how much that is like default parenting is kind of like oriented towards monitoring. And therefore it just doesn't, it just leads to like kind of building a mask of behavior, whereas peers are where you actually like are feel free to act and therefore learn how the world works and therefore like develop yourself in relation to the world. Um,
mm.
but yeah, I don't want to go on that tangent now.
That is a great like tiny hypothesis though. Like that's like a, yeah,
Big if.
bit huge if true. Yeah.
All right. Well, this was lovely. I to be continued.
Yeah. All right. Take care.